Today we're going to be talking about cultivating a restorative lifestyle. My name is Clinton Wilson. My contact will be on the next page, but I work for Rocky Mountain Farmers Union and run a program called AgWell. AgWell supports well-being in agriculture, and we engage in a number of different ways, working with farmers, ranchers, farm workers, and their families, supporting general physical, emotional, mental well-being, providing resources and connections, and collaboration is a big part of what we do. And today with me is Chad Reznicek. I'm going to let him introduce himself and talk a little bit about who he works for.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chad Reznicek. I'm a behavioral health specialist with the Colorado AgriAbility Project. And Clinton and I are both currently in the Fort Collins area, and these are the traditional lands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne nations. My job with Colorado AgriAbility Project is to look at trying to expand and improve behavioral health services and networks across the western part of the country. And for joining us this morning, thank you.
Yeah. There's our contact. I don't know if this slideshow will be available, but feel free to take a picture of that screen and reach out to Chad or I. I don't think, I think we also have this at the end, so you can get it at the end of the slide presentation as well. But with that, mic check is good. Everybody can hear okay? Okay, we'll jump in. So when Lynn reached out about us talking, I really liked the theme of this year's Regenerate conference in cultivating restorative economies, and wanted to look at what does cultivating restorative lifestyle look like, because none of us are exempt from the challenges that life brings, and it brings it to us all differently. And when I was talking to Chad earlier this week, I mentioned that as much of a restorative lifestyle as I've worked to create, life still happens. And on Sunday morning, I woke up, actually, I'll start on Saturday evening. I went out to put my chickens and my goats away, as I do each night. And we have a small herd of goats and a small flock of chickens. And we have a grandmother goat that gave birth to our first litter of kids. And she's one of the sweetest Nigerian dwarf goats I've ever been around. She loves my kids, has raised my daughter from the time she was 18 months old till now she's 7, just like she was one of her kids. And when I was putting them away, she was lying down, and I told her to come over, and she didn't move. And I went over, and she had passed away that afternoon. And it was really surprising. She had been in a standoff just earlier that day with my golden retriever. She was the only one that the golden retriever wouldn't chase because she stood her ground. And she had died that afternoon, and it was really powerful for me. So I picked her up and I took her into the barn, and then I went back and went to bed. Sunday morning, I woke up remembering this. My wife's out of town. My 7-year-old turns to me and is like, she had decided to sleep with me since my wife was gone. And my throat hurts, Dad. I don't feel good. Chad and I had also been talking about this with the idea of heading out of town soon. We're headed to Washington together to do a presentation, and we were like, we got to stay healthy. And my youngest daughter sleeps in the bed with me, and she turns and says, oh no, my throat hurts. I don't feel good. And I'm like, oh no. So I get up, and I told her and my other kids about Comet, who was the grandmother goat that had passed away. And I went out and dug a buddy that's coming over that we've got to excavate this irrigation ditch. And I'm just like, oh my goodness. And so I stopped and took some breath, and I connected with the life of this goat. I connected with the idea that we're traveling, and that if I get sick, I get sick. And I connected with the fact that this irrigation ditch is old and these pipes are old, but this is all just part of life. And how are we present to this? And as I considered this with this talk, the thing that came to me was a restorative lifestyle is not a lifestyle without challenges, without hardship. It's really a lifestyle that allows us to stay balanced, connected and present with the different parts of our life. And it gives us the opportunity to connect with the things that really matter. So today we're going to be discussing this from the SAMHSA's 8 Dimensions of Health. I'm going to let Chad introduce that next, but I really want to invite you as we're talking to hold your questions until the end of each section, but really dialogue with us. I'd love to invite you to get a pen and a piece of paper. There will be some time for interactive dialogue, but mostly I want us to pause so that you can write down things to take with you and to ask questions as they come up. So with that, Chad, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, good morning, everyone. A little bit of background for myself too is that for the last 20 years, I've been a licensed professional counselor, and I've worked in quite a number of different settings with different populations, kind of specializing in trauma, anxiety disorders, other mood disorders, and substance use. And one of the things that's always stuck out to me is really taking a strength-based approach. I've always found it's more helpful to engage people along the lines of what can you start doing to take better care of yourself as opposed to what you need to stop doing. And it's kind of that philosophy that I think resonated with Clinton and I in terms of looking at what would be a good structure for promoting wellness. And SAMHSA has these 8 domains of wellness. And as Clinton mentioned, wellness is not about the absence of disease, illness, or stress. Recognizing that as human beings on this planet, we're going to face our fair share of that. And there are things we can do to add value and meaning and purpose into our lives. And that's kind of how we look at these 8 domains of wellness. They're all sort of interconnected. The dimensions influence each other and affect a person's overall health and quality of life. And the benefit of this is really that you can kind of pick and choose from these. You don't have to make a plan to develop something in every area, but much like ingredients, if you're making a soup, these add some spices, you can kind of tailor that to what you've got going on and to help determine how you want to fix this to best suit your taste and needs. So Clinton, if you could advance us to the next one, it kind of shows what those dimensions are. And we will go through the, give sort of a basic introduction of each of these domains with maybe some suggestions and some questions about how could we look at those domains as something that we could intentionally sort of add some value and meaning to our lives. So those 8 domains are emotional, spiritual, intellectual, physical, environmental, financial, occupational, and social, in no particular order, but those are the 8 domains. So the first one we wanted to start off with, because we are looking at, both Clinton and I are very much in the business of trying to support agricultural producers, recognizing that there's a ton of stressors involved with that. Go ahead, give me one more. I guess we're fine where we are. Sorry, go back one. I apologize, Clinton. So we recognize that agriculture as an occupation is highly unique in terms of both the strengths that are inherent in it and the stressors that are inherent with that. And so I worked for a period of time in corrections, and that's a very unique occupation. And there was some very unique support set up to help people in that, whether you were injured on the job or dealing with trauma or anxiety or all the different intense emotions that go with that work. But one of the things that was unique about it, or distinct from agriculture, is at the end of the day, I would walk out of that facility. I would hear those big metal doors clank behind me, and I would go home. And I would go to my family that were not involved in working in corrections and be able to have that buffer. And so if you look at not just all the different factors beyond a producer's control, whether we're talking about commodity prices or weather or illnesses or disease that can affect herds or crops, but also the legacy issues and the fact that your coworkers are often your family members as well, there's a lot that's unique to that. Plus, working in corrections, we had an employee assistance program where I could go get help or support if I needed with people that knew some of those unique stressors that are part of that occupation. And so we are just in the early stages as a nation in trying to develop that for agricultural producers. As a quick plug, I think there's 11 states currently that have voucher programs to support free behavioral health services for farmers and ranchers. And we look to see that expand as we go forward. Go ahead and advance this, Clinton. So one of the people that's really considered sort of the godfather of agricultural psychology is Dr. Mike Rosman, and he's a farmer and psychologist out of Iowa. And he really kind of hit the ground running in the 80s following the farm crisis there, and really wanted to look at how can we develop support to be able to help farmers and ranchers as they're facing some really uphill battles, in many cases losing their farms. Suicide rates really spiked. And so one of the things he began to look at was this theory of the agrarian imperative. And he saw this as an explanation for much of what goes on for successful farmers, and also looks at kind of their major struggles. So what he says is that, like many animal species, humans have a basic need to acquire sufficient territory and necessary resources to produce food and shelter required by their families and communities. Also called the agrarian personality, this genetically programmed instinct drives farmers to hold on to their land at all costs. The agrarian imperative instills farmers to work incredibly hard, to tolerate unusual pain and adversity, and to trust their own judgment and to take uncommon risks. So he really looks at this as kind of being a genetic predisposition, because one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, with all these stressors, all these variables beyond someone's control, what would cause someone to continue to work along these lines? Both my parents grew up on farms. They opted to not continue farming themselves, but I still have aunts and uncles that do and still hold that same land. And I know that, it's been a difficult life for them, but they can't imagine doing anything else. They see themselves as inherently connected to the land. And we recognize that as kind of a starting point for so many people. It's just, it's not a job, it's a choice. When things got really hard in corrections, I could make a decision to search out another profession or a population that would better suit what my interest areas were, maybe my family situation. And for many people that are holding on to their fourth generation of this same amount of land, that's simply not an option. And we have to be able to recognize that if we want to be able to support and help people where they're at. So go ahead, Clinton, advance us.
All right.
So I'm going to draw a little bit from Dr. Rosman. He continues to present, continues to back any sort of efforts involving the support for our agricultural producers. And there's a ton of great resources out there if we're trying to better understand sort of the culture and the landscape that producers are facing right now. And we've got that slide coming up in a little bit, but we want to try to be along the lines of being strength-based. I appreciate that he recognizes there's more good than bad news right now about the well-being of farmers. So despite the worst economic recession in agriculture since the 80s, the rates of bankruptcy, suicide, and farm loss are not nearly as great as they were during the 80s farm crisis. So we have evolved in some ways. Farmer lenders' solution-seeking efforts have become more collegial rather than adversarial since the 80s farm crisis, although recognize there's still a long way to go. My dad was an insurance agent in a very small town in rural Nebraska, and to this day, he still separates his social circle based on those that tried to help farmers in the 80s and those that profited from it. And so I know we've got a long ways to go as a culture. And at least along the lines of behavioral health support, there are better resources today to assist farmers. There's dispute mediation, there's helplines, ag safety and health programs, behavioral health services suited to farmers and rural residents. In fact, the entire country has farm and ranch agricultural stress assistance networks. So depending where you live, there are networks with resources available. Clinton and I, being in Fort Collins, are part of the Western Region Agricultural Stress Assistance Program. These are some of the resources on farm stress. I don't want to take too much time going into that, but if people are interested in it, there's some great information through those links.
And as we're going through, I would encourage anybody who wants to capture something to take a screenshot with your phone or on your device to resource some of these and any of the other slides that you'd like.
Yeah, or feel free to drop your email in the chat box and we'll be glad to send them to you that way.
Absolutely. Before we move on, I want to check in if there's any questions that anybody has or anything that's come up in the slide or the chat box around what Chad just shared on the occupational domain.
And while we're waiting for that, one of the things I'd like to just say in terms of why we want to look at that occupational domain is, again, recognizing that there's some really unique strengths and stressors related to agriculture as an occupation and as a calling. And so we want to honor that as kind of a starting point. And also recognizing that as we are involved in partnerships and collaborations to increase services and increase supports, it's important to know I can't be an expert in soybean production or dairy cattle or any of that, but to the best of my ability, I do it's my responsibility to know some of those unique stressors and some of those unique aspects of agriculture to best support someone. As a clinician, I can't advise someone to take a 2-week vacation and have any understanding of what it really means to operate a 365-degree operation. And so we want to make sure we're recognizing these pieces as a starting point.
All right, if there's no questions, I'm going to move on to the next domain, and that's the environmental domain. And this domain focuses on good health by occupying pleasant, stimulating environments that support well-being. And this looks different for all of us. The main thing is that it's space for us to move and breathe and live and grow. And it's to grow the good stuff. It's not the stuff that will harm us that we want to introduce. It's the spaces that really invite us to more life. So just like plants and animals that we work with, we need space to breathe, to take in sun, fresh air, moisture, and the ability to move and grow both internally inside of us and externally in the physical spaces that we're in. And so I've got 3 points here that just kind of highlight this. And as I read through these, I'd kind of like to invite you to just see what it looks like in your life. Maybe not all these apply to all of us, but I think in our culture today, this consumer, social media, tech-driven, fast-paced, overcrowded culture that we live in, a lot of us can identify with this. And these 4 things really come into play in most of our lives as impacts. So the first one is just getting rid of clutter and overcrowding in our life, both physically and mentally. We have spaces that are overcrowded. Our brains are constantly thinking about all the things that we're taking in. Most of our lives in our heads are just too full. Hundreds of text messages, emails, info from scrolling social media often keep us distracted from the things in our life that matter. And all of us have different lives with different things that matter, but I know for myself, when I get distracted and crowded out by the things that I'm not as connected to, I feel super disappointed at the end of the day that I gave so much time and attention to something that doesn't really matter. And I missed out with the things on my farm or with my family or with my friends that I wish that I would have been connected to. Many of us live and work in spaces that are crowded with stuff. Some new. All of us are able to purchase anything that we want at the click of a button on our phone or on our computer. And a lot of us have just stuff that we don't need, but a lot of it is old stuff. And I am the biggest, I am guilty of this as much as anybody, of keeping old stuff that represent things that I'll get to one day. And it crowds out my barn, my garage, my closet. And these are things that it's great to recycle things and it's great to reuse things. And I definitely am not a proponent of just throwaway culture. But if things are not going to actually get fixed or you're not going to have the time, by giving that space and getting rid of that, it frees up space for something new that does give you life to come in, or it just frees up space for you to breathe. And that's really important. So in order to restore, we need space to breathe and connect with things that we care about. So the first tip that I'm going to offer, I didn't actually steal from Nancy Reagan, but I love that she promoted it back, I think, in the 80s. And Chad and I were talking at a talk in Western Colorado, and somebody mentioned the importance of a nobody to them. And I was like, what is that? And as we discussed it, it came full circle that so many of us say yes to things that are not healthy for us, that we don't need. It's yes, I can go do this. I can pick up that. I can attend this. But really, the healthy response is for us to say no. And so this idea of a nobody really resonated with me, because it's hard for me to say no when I feel like somebody is expecting me to do something, or I really want to do that instead of this. And so I'm going to throw this out as an option for you to figure out who can be a nobody in your life that helps you realize when you're at your limit, when you're full, when you're already overcommitted, and to help you say no. And the example that was given at the talk that we were at was somebody that worked on the same team, and they would give them a look, and they knew the look. And if they said yes, the person would be would look down and would come to them and say, you knew that you didn't have space in this for this. And if they said no, the person would celebrate and somehow come and congratulate them. So I wanted to throw out nobody for you guys. The next one that I mentioned a moment ago is breath. And do you have space where you can breathe? Breath is vital for life for all things. All living things need breath or will die. The plants, the animals that we live around will die. And fresh, clean air in your environment is vital. If you're in a tight, closed space, get outside to breathe fresh air. It's so important. We'll talk about breath more a little bit later, but before we move any further, I do want to invite everybody for like the next 15 seconds to just take some cleansing breaths. We've got about an hour left in our discussion today, and just fully fill up your lungs and then fully exhale. And let's take a couple breaths, and then I'm going to move forward, but I'm going to pause. Breathe in. And exhale fully. Breathe in. And exhale fully. Most of us take about 25,000 breaths a day, and most of us don't think about many of them. Something that has been a huge help for me is incorporating at the beginning of my day and the end of my day, taking conscious breaths. And I'll give you guys a couple other breathing exercises later to incorporate. But I read a book during the lockdown time of the early pandemic called Breath by James Nestor. And if you haven't found this book, I would highly recommend it. It totally shifted the way that I interact with my breath, the way that I breathe in and out my nose instead of in and out my mouth. If you have heard of this or haven't, I now tape my mouth shut when I breathe or when I sleep at night so that I can breathe in and out of my nose. And it has revolutionized my relationship with my sinuses. So anyway, check the book out if you have the opportunity. And then I'm going to pass it back over to Chad to talk about one more environmental piece that he's been working on.
So one of the projects that we have going on is training clinicians in rural areas, therapists and social workers to be able to work effectively with agricultural producers. And there's a big push. In fact, it's kind of a standard of practice in therapy to make sure that what you're doing, your techniques are tailored and adapted to meet your clientele and the populations you work with. And in the short time relatively that I've been focused on agriculture as a population and agricultural producers and farm workers, I've yet to find a program that's designed to help people have the tools to really do outreach and work effectively in a way that's hopefully meaningful and purposeful with this population. So we've developed a training program, and kind of the foundation of it is the idea, going back to that agrarian imperative notion that I've mentioned and the connection to land, is really looking at, again, I can't be an expert in soybean production. I can't learn all the ins and outs of the different type of row crop or livestock production. But if I were to start working with someone that is a producer, one of the ways to give me a window into their world is to ask for their aerial photo. Almost every farmhouse, and especially in Midwest where I grew up, had that. In fact, my parents, amongst my siblings' senior pictures, they circle both their respective farms that they grew up on. And now in the days of Google Earth and everything else, it's pretty easy to get sort of an overview of someone's operation. And so as a clinician, it gives me the chance to invite someone to kind of walk me through their day-to-day operation. And from that lens, from this bird's eye view above the operation, what I'd ask each of you to do is just take a moment, think about your land, your work, and is there an aspect or an area or a piece of that that really highlights for you a sense of meaning and purpose? And if you feel comfortable, I'd ask you just drop that in the chat. if you could again zoom in from an aerial perspective to one piece of that that really recharges you, to affirms your sense of connection to what you're doing. For some people, I know it's that we've talked to you about this, it's where the calving operation is in the spring, or where their kids are born in terms of, if they've got sheep or goats. For others, it could be, I know for one gentleman, he did a lot of dairy cattle. And so for him, it was the hay barn. When the hay barn was full, that smell and that sense of being able to walk past that and see that there's ample availability there for him, that's where there was a sense of meaning. So anyway, if that resonates, if there's a part of your operation that stands out to you as that kind of like safe place to go to, where you feel like it kind of recharges you or gives you meaning or purpose, I'd be curious to just hear that.
Just going to go ahead and amplify comment in the chat about welcoming community members to the land with community garden and letting them get to know the animals as an answer.
Spaciousness, yep, that's great. And so I think to just highlight kind of a theme that runs through this, going back to occupation, to everything else, to the 8 domains themselves, we know that everything we're talking about today doesn't do much to reduce the stressors that you all have. And the hope is that by just bringing some intentionality to some of these things, and to really make a focused effort to look at, there's 27 variables on any given day that I can't control, and there's a few things that I can. And so one of them may be just looking at, again, what part of my operation does allow me to recharge? And as I walk there, can I just be aware of my breath? Just little things that we can do to hopefully reduce some of that stress response that goes on. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Clinton.
Well, and with that, I will ask if anybody has any questions. Feel free to unmute and ask them around the environment piece or any comments. And then I'm going to let Chad move into the next domain.
All right, go ahead and advance this, Clinton.
Did it advance?
So, yep, thank you. The financial domain, the way SAMHSA defines this, go ahead, go back, there you go. The financial domain defined by SAMHSA is satisfaction with current and future financial situations. So to footnote that's sometimes easier said than done, and especially when we look at agriculture, and again, all those variables beyond someone's control. Looking at what I could borrow from Purdue University for the Ag Economy Barometer, it looks like at least back in August of this last quarter, things were on a slight increase, maybe a slightly better trajectory, but the reality is with that, we all know it could change at any given moment. And in spite of the fact that this temporary sort of financial farm outlook looks a little bit better and it helped boost farmer sentiment in August, most people that responded to this show significant concerns about how much it's going to cost to get their 2023 crop in the ground. And so we know that can change in any given moment. And go ahead and advance this, Clinton. Neither Clinton nor I are financial experts in this area, but we recognize that it is one of the big stressors. Through that Western Region Agricultural Stress Assistance Network that I mentioned earlier, they did kind of a baseline report, and they surveyed 796 agricultural producers across the western part of the country. Financial worries was listed as one of the top 3 stressors in that group, rightfully so. And we're fortunate, at least in Washington State, through this whole stress response network, they actually have an ag economist that can go and meet with people at their kitchen tables to help them look through their situation, see if there's things they can do to help improve their lot. And one of the things that he points out is that record keeping is often the key starting point for them. And so being able to take an accurate and objective assessment of one's financial situation is key. And we know that for this can create some anxiety for some people, and anxiety is really a fear-based response. Like if you think about it from the standpoint of if you've ever had an ingrown toenail and it like just started spurred up on you one day as you're walking, if you ever been kind of afraid to take that sock off and afraid of what you're going to see there, that's kind of that same sort of response that goes on. And so a lot of what he's found is that people are worried about their financial situation and try to protect themselves from that fear by kind of keeping it at a distance and not taking that sock off to look at what their actual damage may be. So a main starting point is really to try to get an accurate assessment of what your situation is, because it's only by that that we can try to figure out what might be some variables that can be influenced and adapted. So your county extension agents can be a good starting point to see resources that are available in your area. And again, if you want to drop your email in the chat, if we can help you find something localized in your area to better connect you to some of those resources or options, we'll be glad to do that. Farm Aid, their website and their hotline, 1-800-FARM AID, can also help. They've got resources tailored for each of their areas. And again, they are well connected to this sort of baseline report. They know that those financial worries are one of the big stressors and probably one of the most significant things that people call in to get help with. That or possibly advocacy or mediation or things of that nature. But that's another good resource to start. And then there's also this link for 12 practices of highly effective farmers. That's done by an ag economist. And his point there is that out of everyone he's worked with and consulted with, 95% of the people don't do these basic sort of simple practices that could actually get them into a better situation. So it's worth checking out. I don't know that it's going to be the end all be all, but again, anything you can do in any of these domains of wellness to kind of move the needle forward, that's kind of what we want to see. And go ahead and advance this, Clinton. So at this point, Sam, if you could set us up with some breakout groups, and I apologize if that creates some anxiety for anyone. Well, actually, do we want to do that with 11 people, or do we just want to open it up to some discussion here?
I'm great with the discussion. If we want to, I can stop screen sharing.
Actually, go ahead and just keep that one up if you would.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'd ask people to consider is that, this is obviously something, if you're involved in production agriculture, that you've had to take on for better or worse. And from our experience, very few people have received a lot of formal training in how best to navigate that. So some of the things we'd like to do is just draw upon your experiences. And I'd ask you to consider these 3 questions. How did you learn about managing the financial side of your operation? Who were your mentors? Who taught you? What was the most important thing you learned early on, and what do you wish you would have learned early on? And then if we could just kind of encapsulate all that to one question, which would be, if you were talking to a beginning farmer now, first generation, someone just beginning their work, what might be the one piece of advice you'd want to share with them regarding the financial aspect? So I know that's a lot, but if there's any part of that people feel comfortable talking about, again, whether you want to raise your hands and share with us collectively or just drop in the chats, we'd love to hear your feedback there.
Hi, I can share.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to have taken a couple classes and workshops on financial planning around the ranch. I think one of the things I've learned from it is how important record keeping is, and I think that's one of the things I also struggle with the most. Is when you've got animals in front of you, it's really hard to kind of put those more tangible to-do list items higher for me on my list than putting the spreadsheet. And so I end up feeling a bit intimidated to catch up with it. Right now I need to update my egg log, and I think it's been probably a solid 4 months. So it feels like a big stressor, but I know when I do kind of do that a little bit every month, it helps out. So I'm working on setting aside, a day every month at the beginning of the month to try and just get everything in order. And then kind of dividing out I have a lot of kind of markets here and venues. I raise chicken and turkeys, pigs and beef. I also have eggs. So kind of keeping all of those separate while also keeping up with them consistently together has been one of my challenges and advice for myself and for everyone else.
Rachel, it makes me think of a book I read. I think his name's James Carr, and it was called Atomic Habits. But it was making little small goals, like when you were talking about you do it monthly, breaking it down so it's not this huge task at the end of the year. We have a tendency to push things off, but when you can do little pieces, it's really helpful. And I think with finances and record keeping, that really applies. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, very much appreciated, Rachel. And by means of a thumbs up, would you advise other people to take some of those courses or to seek out some of that guidance? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and like
some of the classes were a lot to take on, and so I went into them expecting to start and then come out of the class with a whole entire plan and just revamped me, and obviously we know that incremental changes are more sustainable than huge ones. So I think going into these classes and knowing hey, you might not walk out of it doing exactly all the things that they're telling you to do, but that's a long-term goal, and I can kind of take pieces of it along the way.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And that's right in line with what everything else we're talking about today. So again, totally appreciate that and your willingness to share. So kudos to you for reaching out to get some help. Often, as I mentioned, our county extension and the overall extension programs through our land grant universities offer courses and offer some resources in those areas. And so again, anything we can do to kind of just increase our toolbox, increase what we can add to our day-to-day soup, that's what we want.
And a couple people in the chat have talked about HMI, Holistic Management Institute, as being a place where they've found that. So thanks for sharing that. And with that, with time considered, I'm going to keep us moving forward and head us to our next domain, which is the social domain, developing a sense of connection, belonging, and a well-developed social support system. And I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly after this, but this first one I wanted to stop on because this one, over the past 10 months since I started this work with Agwell, Brene Brown and her comments around love and belonging have probably impacted my view on our social connectedness and this idea of belonging as much as anything. And she writes, a deep sense of love and belonging is an irreducible need of all people. We are biologically, cognitively, physically, and spiritually wired to love, to be loved, and to belong. When those needs are not met, we do not function as we were meant to. We break, we fall apart, we numb, we ache, we hurt others, and we get sick. And as I took that in, I really seeing belonging right there with love. And love is something that I really cherish with my friends and my family and the people that I'm close with. But that sense of where do I belong really did stick. And as I've been interacting with farmers and ranchers and people working in agriculture over the past year, I realized that those places in our lives have degraded and they have gone away and we don't have those connections. And so I think finding our people and where we belong is really important. The challenge of farmers asking for help has been a huge theme since I got started in this work. Farmers are, and my experience with this is absolutely true, are so quick to offer help, but slow to ask for it. And for me, I think that one of the major contributors is because of our overcrowded, busy lives, we've lost our deep connections to people within our communities that we trust and that want to help us as much as we want to help them. And so Brene Brown also in her book, Dare to Lead, talks about finding people that you trust in your people. And she recommends writing down 3 people, enough that can fit on I think she says a small business card or something. I can't remember, but I want to encourage you right now on your paper, whatever, to write down 3 people in your life that you trust, that you want to engage in this relationship further so that they trust you and you can develop this relationship where it's not that you have to ask them for help, but that you're in relationship enough where they know and they want to contribute just as you're contributing with them. And so I'm going to pause for just a second before I move to the next slide. Think about 3 people, write them down. And then I also want you to consider, as you're writing them down, what could you do to grow those relationships? Get together for coffee, ask them over for a meal, ask them to go for a walk, go ask if you can work on their farm, whatever it is. 3 people, how can you grow that relationship? All right, and with that talk on connecting with people, I want to hit 2 things. And Dr. Vivek Murthy, who was the Attorney General, the Surgeon General for the Obama administration, has recently released a book, maybe a year or 2 ago, that he called Together. And he did a lot of research and gave a lot of reflection on what he had seen while he was a Surgeon General. And he makes a case for loneliness as a public health concern, a root cause and contributor to many of the epidemics sweeping the world today, from alcohol and drug addiction to violence to depression and anxiety, and is loneliness. And I'm going to pause there because those are big components that we've run across within the world of agriculture and mental health and well-being. Addiction, depression, anxiety, these are all impacting us in different ways. And he really attributes it to loneliness. Loneliness has also been associated with coronary heart disease, high blood pressure, stroke, and dementia. However, he says that social bonds enhance our health and how we perform in the workplace, at school, how we show up for our families, how we connect, how content we feel in our lives. So I want to ask you another question to reflect on your paper is, how do you relate with this statement in your life? How do social bonds impact your health, work, school, family, and your contentment? That's a big question, and it's something that I want you to write down, and then hopefully later when you're taking space for yourself to reflect on what you've learned today or what you've learned during the Regenerate conference, that you can really consider that statement. So I want to contrast loneliness with alone time, because I don't think that should be lost. Many farmers, ranchers, ag workers, they do a lot of work by themselves, and connecting with their community and their family is super important. But it's also really important for us to connect with ourselves. And a restorative lifestyle must start with restoring yourself if you're going to be able to give from a place of life and abundance to the people you need, to your production, to your workers, to whatever it is. And so a couple of statements that I took from a book called Connectable by Ryan Jenkins and Stephen Van Cohen. It's geared mostly towards the business world, but I really found some of the stuff that they talked about so applicable to my life and to the things that I'm seeing in the agricultural communities. Is you have to disconnect from some of the busyness, from some of the commitments, in order to reconnect with yourself. And so I want to ask you all, what does restorative time look like for you? If this talk could be, whittled down to one thing, it's really like, what does a restorative lifestyle for you look like? So I want to throw that question out to you, knowing that we don't have time to get into it right now, but I want to ask you, how often do you do it? And how can you incorporate more restorative alone time in your life? So again, I'm going to pause before I move to the next slide and just let you reflect on that. What does restorative time look like for you? A walk, a hike, preparing a good meal, sitting on your back porch, having a drink with friends at the end of your day, whatever it is, what restores you? How often do you do it? And how can you incorporate more of it in your life? Before we move to the next section, I would like for us to take a minute, and if you feel comfortable sharing again, I'd love for you to drop in the chat, where do you find belonging and a sense of connection in your community? Historically, we found it in churches, at granges, and I feel I've seen people say that they don't connect in those ways anymore. And so I'm curious to know, as I dive deeper in this, where do you find that belonging? And then as you're putting that in, if you also want to offer some suggestions where you think we as a support community might be able to support farmers and ranchers with places that they would join. There's an amazing project called the Coffee Break Project down in southern Colorado that provides coffee and donuts for farmers and ranchers a couple times a week. There's a place out in Routt County that does an open mic at an old barn once a month at the Luttrell Barn. I know that there's some anonymous online meetup groups. So if you want to come off mute, or if you want to drop in the chat, just where you find community. And if you think of anything that we as support people might be able to support farmers and ranchers by providing those spaces, we'd love to hear it.
Looks like I have a hand raised from 505-347-9803.
That's me. Thank you for announcing my phone number.
I'm sorry,
Anyway,
it's visible to everyone
it's
on
okay,
the call.
Don't worry. It's okay. My question is not related specifically to the question asked. Are you, the two of you, going to be at the conference in Denver?
I am not, and I'll answer for Chad. Chad is not. We're going to be in Washington State presenting for a farm and ranch retreat up there. But there will be an AgWell table at the Regenerate conference, and one of my colleagues, Leanne Sanders, will be leading a roundtable discussion around well-being, I believe, in agriculture.
Okay, thank you for that. And then I'm only on the audio part of it because Zoom doesn't necessarily work in my area. But you guys are talking really fast. It's really hard to take notes because you guys are just, I know time is of essence, but just letting you know that. Thank you. That's all.
Excellent.
Appreciate
Thanks.
what you're saying, though. It's so necessary.
Thanks for the feedback, Sarah.
Sunny, I think that we will have transcripts of these talks, and they also are recorded. So I know that sometimes taking notes while you're listening is valuable, but we also have a backup for you to come back to and to reference. So for everybody's sake here also, just know that we will have the recording of these sessions, and we can also work on making the transcripts available for folks to read if you want to come back to what was said.
Thanks, Sarah. And I will make a caveat of this is the first time that Chad and I have combined forces on these 8 domains, and an hour and a half seems like a really long time. And the fact that we are down to like 30 minutes and we're halfway done is a little intimidating. So I'm going to apologize ahead of time. We are going to keep talking fast and trust that you will do what Sarah has invited and go back and review these transcripts later. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Chad and silence my dog.
All right, and I will try to ratchet it back a little bit from auctioneer speed and try to make sure that we're being heard effectively. So thank you for that feedback. So the emotional domain, the goal here is to cope effectively with life and create satisfying relationships. Clinton, go ahead and advance me. So again, going back to Dr. Rosman, he looks at the most important asset for consumers in the food chain is the agricultural producers. This makes total sense. And he has really specialized, as I mentioned, since the 80s farm crisis in looking at behavioral health services for those involved in production agriculture. And he's done some great research, found that farmers and ranchers' behavioral health is positively correlated with optimal livestock health, even dairy milk production, crop production, sound decision making, personal and family well-being. So the importance of taking care of oneself radiates down through all these different areas and permeates that as well. And unlike the weather, government policies, everything else that you don't have control over, most of us can control the vast majority of our behavior. and how we think about our thinking. So one of the things I do, if anyone calls into the Farm Aid hotline in the western part of the country looking for behavioral health support, I'm offered to follow up with them, and then I will help navigate insurance, figure out if there's no cost options, figure out what their needs are, talk through the basics of them, basically offer some consultation, and then get them linked up to do a warm handoff to the right services at the right time. So really appreciate that Farm Aid hotline, and they've seen an increase in calls during the last quarter, the last 90 days. So they attribute this to skyrocketing input costs, greatly increased risk for our farmers who also face climate extremes of every kind. Many areas of the country have had record flooding, while others are in a multi-year drought that seems to have no end in sight. Farmers are both tough and independent, but many are nearing their breaking point, accounting for the upsurge in their call volume. So we recognize that these increasing stressors have that impact, and we want to make sure there's safety nets out there. So one of the things that Dr. Rosman's recognized in his research is some differences between behavioral health issues for those involved in farming and ranching compared to the general population. So for the sake of time, I won't go through all the specifics of this, but there's a couple things to be aware of. It's usually relationship problems that are the first thing that will bring someone in to get some help. And that accounts for about 40% of diagnoses and services. Following that, it's really anxiety and depression are kind of the two main things. Substance use is rarely the point of entry, but it often occurs about 40% of the time with other diagnoses. Go ahead and advance for me, Clinton. So one of the things to be aware of regarding this is that farming, those involved in agriculture tend not to have some of the more serious and debilitating behavioral health problems, like for instance, psychotic disorders, very severe bipolar. So these really severe things tend not to be present in that population, at least nowhere near what it looks like in the general population. So a lot of that goes back to, I think, some of those inherent strengths in agriculture. And the last thing I'll say regarding this is that ag producers are more likely to experience anxiety and depressive illness than the general population. So those things tend to spike a little bit in this population. And Dr. Rosman attributes that to those genetic predispositions toward ADHD. And there are some very positive aspects of ADHD because it really is about, if you navigate that well, that's the basis of multitasking and be able to juggle all these different chainsaws that producers have to juggle. And then lastly, that genetic predisposition to increased alertness to threats that again comes with having to navigate all these different things, all these different variables coming at us from different angles. So to understand that a little bit, I want to talk just basically about functioning in the brain. And there's a really fantastic neuroscientist named Dr. Bruce Perry. And he studied a lot about working with trauma in children and helping people overcome that. So he describes us as a species as slow, naked, and weak. We don't have big claws. We can't run all that fast. We don't have big fangs. And so the vast majority of our time on this planet as a species, we've evolved in small hunter-gatherer societies. And our brains are really struggling to catch up to how we've developed into more sort of larger communal settings. So he recognizes that there's two main adaptations that have helped us to survive and evolve to the point where we are. One of these is the fight or flight response. And this is hardwired into the basic foundational aspects of our brain, starting from the very low point. So if you can see this slide, on the left-hand side, there is just kind of a basic outline of the brain. That little piece sticking down, that's the brainstem, connects to the spinal cord. And the brain works in this sort of use-dependent hierarchy of more complex functions, starting lower at the bottom of the brain, advancing in complexity to the highest parts of the brain. So to understand how this works with fight or flight, see that snake over there on the other end. Let's assume we have, how many participants in this call? We have 11. Let's say that we were all part of the same tribe and we're going out in the forest to go hunt for a wild boar to feed our community, feed our tribe. And while we're out there in the forest, I get bit by a poisonous blue snake. It makes me really sick. I have to rely on the kindness of my tribe members, you guys, to carry me back to the village. Let's say the medicine woman fixes me up. In about 2 weeks, I'm kind of back to normal. But it's been a pretty excruciatingly painful 2 weeks. I join you guys again for the next hunting party where we go out in the forest and we get out there a little ways. Now, the corner of my eye, I see a blue flower. What happens in my brain in a split second is really what's built into this fight or flight system. So starting from the top down, the first thing that goes out of the window is this higher thinking, this part of the brain called the frontal cortex. And this is the part of the brain that allows us to plan for the future. It's what allows us to engage in complex problem solving, to weigh out pros and cons. All these things are really essential for high level activity. That's the first thing that goes out the window for the sake of efficiency. Because if I'm faced with a life threatening situation, I don't need to be looking at how well stocked are we with vegetables and other meats for the coming winter. That's just not part of that equation. So that goes out the window. The part right below that, kind of the cluster, the yellow section there in the brain image, that's the limbic system, or relatively in that area is the limbic system, the emotional center. That fires up with fear. Right below that, the diencephalon, this is the part we share with lizards or reptiles, sometimes called the lizard brain or the reptile brain. That controls all sort of basic movement and coordination. So that fires up and tells me there's a threat. And then the brainstem that controls everything I don't need to think about, my breathing, my heart rate, all those things, that pumps me with adrenaline to get ready to run or to fight off this threat. But it happens in this split second where the brain goes into this sort of survival mode. And this works really well with something like a blue snake. It does not work very well when our stressors are all those things I mentioned at the beginning of this that agricultural producers face. It does not work well when my stressor is walking to the mailbox expecting that there's going to be a late notice in amongst that mail. It doesn't work well when I see another day of no rain whatsoever and nothing in the forecast for the next 10 days. But the brain, the way it's evolved, it doesn't distinguish between those things. And so the same elements that were meant to protect us from saber-toothed tigers or grizzly bears or poisonous snakes or whatever it may be, our brains are struggling to catch up when we're looking at the modern stressors that we face. And the impact still becomes the same. Much like any other piece of equipment you may have in your operation, the constant exposure to stress and strain is what causes breakdowns. And our brains are no different. And so something as simple as breathing, which Clinton will get into a little bit more in a few minutes here, can have a massive impact in changing that automatic response. In terms of the way the brain functions, if we can control our breathing, it controls our heart rate and it pumps the brakes on this fight or flight response. Because the downside of constantly having this spike up is that we get flooded with some really nasty chemicals, one of which is called cortisol. It's a stress hormone, and it has some really negative impacts on us. So anything we can do to recognize, control our stressors, respond well, even if we can't stop that response from happening, if we can pump the brakes on it as soon as possible and take steps to mitigate that, it helps in so many areas, from preventing anxiety, depression. Anxiety is often looked at as being on red alert all the time. It's an over response to this fight or flight system, where the fight or flight system isn't picking out that blue flower connected to the blue snake. It's just recognizing threats everywhere without a whole lot of rhyme or reason behind it. And the impact on the brain is the same. So anything we can do to stop that's important. So two primary survival mechanisms we have that helped us survive from basically good-looking wandering apes in the forest to where we are today is this fight or flight, but most importantly, it's our tribe. It's that community around us that has helped us to survive well. And along those lines, I don't want to get too heavy on this, but I do want to talk a little bit about suicide very quickly, because what tends to happen, what more and more research is showing in terms of post-autopsies is that there are very significant physical changes in the brains of those people that commit suicide. And there's a lot of evidence pointing to this being constant exposure to stress responses and breakdowns in the way that the brain normally kind of heals and regenerates itself. And so to tie this into that tribe, The interpersonal theory of suicide looks at some of the main risk factors are one, a sense of being alone. It's called thwarted belongingness. And the second is perceived burdensomeness. I feel like a burden to others. If you have those two sort of social components, along with the capability and desire for things to end, for the suffering to end, those are the biggest risk factors. The positive and flip side of that is that anything we can do in our circle of relationships to foster that sense of connection with other people, to challenge that sense of aloneness, and to express and convey our sense of value for other people, is to take on that sense of being a burden. By virtue of doing those two things in our social interactions, we help to reduce risks for other people. And so I want to stress that in terms of tying back to the social connection that Clinton brought up. And social connectedness may very be one of our most important protective factors. As I mentioned, that sense of tribe, that belonging is our greatest survival mechanism. It's also a huge protective factor. And there's a fantastic study called the Harvard Happiness Study. I won't go into all this, but the real quick and dirty of it is that this project followed 724 men since they were teenagers in 1938. JFK was actually one of the original participants in this study, but they followed up with these participants every couple of years and actually did interviews with some of the other people in their life. And the clearest message that came out of this study, and it's still going on, clearest message that we get from the 75-year study is this: good relationships keep us happier and healthier. The one thing that all these participants kept coming back to in terms of quality of life, sense of meaning and purpose, was the value they put on their relationships. So just wanted to stress that. And then lastly, in terms of, again, doing whatever we can to make some intentional small changes, there's this concept called neuroplasticity, which means it refers to the physiological changes in the brain that happen as a result of our interactions with our environment. And from the time the brain begins developing in utero until the day we die, this process allows the brain to continue to reorganize and respond to our changing needs. It's a dynamic process that allows us to learn from and adapt to different experiences. This never goes away. And so that whole thing about you can't teach an old dog new tricks is just simply doesn't fly in the face of science. No matter how old us dogs may be, we can still learn new tricks, and it's worth that. And it's worth expanding that social network.
Before we move to the next domain, is there any questions anybody wants to drop in the chat for Chad before we move away? He just gave a lot of really important information around behavioral health and cognitive interactions with this stuff. Feel free to drop it in and we can address it at the end if there's time. I'm going to jump into the next domain, which is called the physical domain, recognizing the need for physical activity, healthy foods, and sleep. And I'm going to go through this one, I apologize, rather quickly so that we can kind of reflect on this in our life at the end. But I want to start by hitting what Chad just talked about with the fight or flight. There's a book that came out last year or the year before called Burnout, Burnout, Burnout by the Nagoski sisters. And it really talks about the stress response cycle and the importance of completing the stress response cycle. And what Chad was talking about with the snake and the way that we respond, they modeled their stuff off of a gazelle that was being chased by a lion and realized that the most important part of the gazelle, if it gets caught or if it doesn't get caught, is the end of the cycle. So it starts at a resting state. The lion comes up, it gets tense. It responds by running or freezing. And then if it gets caught, it freezes. If it gets away, it has to stop. And the most important part of this, so that it can go back to grazing and get this stress out of its system, you can see here to the left, all these pressures that we experience in our life. Chad talked about so many of them that relate to agriculture. They stay in this cycle and they keep us stressed all the time. And this starts to wear down our bodies. The most important part of this is to finish the cycle. And the way that we finish this is the Nagoski sisters say it's physically, and it's getting it out. It's getting the stress out of our body. And physical activity, although we're on our feet working on our farms or ranches all the time, 10 to 20 minutes of a brisk walk, a run, a bike ride can get this out quicker than anything. creativity, doing something like painting, poetry, singing, dancing. Those are ways that your body can reconnect with you and get it out. Laughing, crying, physical affection. They said that a 20-second hug can erase hours of sitting in stress. And deep breathing. And like Chad said, I'm going to give you guys a breathing exercise in a moment. The other thing that helps us be more resilient is if our bodies can be healthy to respond to these stresses. And a couple ways that I'm going to encourage you to look at in your life is the nutrition and the fuel that you're putting in. And if you're putting in things that are low health, then your body's not going to be getting the nutrients that it needs. Nutrition helps our brain function better. It helps our bodies stay healthy so we can live longer. Our organs, our muscles, boosts immunity. It helps our digestive system. It helps us be able to be connected to that which we're putting in and hence that which we're putting out. Hydration, different for everybody. It's just a plug. Drink water. Whether or not you're working in the 100-degree sun or you're staring at a computer, having hydration, particularly water-based liquids, is so important. Our bodies are primarily oxygen. As Chad takes a drink of water, yes. Our bodies are primarily water, and we need that to get our blood to circulate well, to keep our joints lubricated, to keep our organs functioning properly. Again, I'm going quick, but these will be available in this, will be available for you to go back and write down. A restorative lifestyle prioritizes rest. Just like our garden needs rest, our fields need rest, our livestock needs rest, so do we. And so the next breathing exercise I'm going to give you is a breathing exercise for resting and digesting. It's from moments of stress and moments after we have taken in a lot, whether or not it's food or an experience or something stressful. I want to invite us to do a couple of breaths with this 4 count in and 6 count out. The important thing here is that we breathe in, but then we fully exhale. So I'm going to pause. You can take a cleansing breath. You can imagine ourselves being this dog, taking this breath in with our arms up and fully resting, and then breathe in for 4 seconds. 2, 3, 4. Now stop. And now breathe out for 6 seconds. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now do it one more time on your own. Breathe out. Again, conscious breathing connects us. As Chad said, it slows us down. Before I go to bed every night, I do another breathing exercise that I'll show you in just a moment that helps me kind of pause. But sleep is so important, and we have busied ourselves and we have deprioritized sleep. Adults need 7 to 9 hours, youth 8 to 10. We're all different. Some of us might need 6, some of us might need 10. The luxury of having that isn't always available, but prioritizing it will vastly improve your well-being and the way that you interact with life. There's lots of ways that you can do it. Don't look at your phone before you go to bed. Don't drink alcohol before you go to bed. Keep your room dark as possible. Have white noise if that helps you relax. Whatever works for you, prioritize and incorporate it. Your sleep and rest is vital to your well-being. Laughter is something that has been proven over and over through science to boost the immune system, to help us relax, to bring the tension from hard conversations down. Review these laughter tips when you have a chance and go out and swing and laugh just like this little girl. I love that. I have a 7-year-old and she brings so much opportunity for me to stop and laugh when I get over serious and over focused on other things that don't matter as much as those moments of connecting. And then I'm going to pass it back over to Chad to talk about play and the importance of play. And it's come out in research that this is so vital. Brene Brown really hits it on the power of vulnerability. Chad, tell us about what play means to you.
So one of the things I do as a hobby is I build cigar box guitars. And I started this when I was working in corrections in a juvenile correctional facility and teaching young adults how to play an instrument. And we found out that maybe 6 strings was a bit intimidating, but a one string cigar box guitar, put those in someone's hands. These were often kids that could not sit still no matter what consequences they were facing. But once they started to pick up a few basic notes and rhythms, they could engage with that for as long as you gave them the opportunity. And so I became really interested in some of the research behind it. And it's kind of fascinating in terms of what can happen if you learn to play an instrument. And there's a lot of benefits to play. Basically, in terms of going back to the brain real quick, one of the ways to repair that damage from the stress response, the fancy name for this is multisensory pattern repetitive movements. But ultimately what that means is something that engages as many of our senses as possible and allows some bit of repetition or rhythm to it. This could be casting a fly rod. This could be crochet. This could be painting. It is definitely, there's very few human activities we do that utilize more components of the brain in harmony with each other than playing an instrument. And there's some fantastic research that found, they researched individuals between the ages of 65 and 80 that took 6 months of piano lessons. And just in those 6 months, at that stage in life, there were significant gains in verbal processing, in the ability to have spatial processing, memory recall. And there's been a lot of research to show that anything involved learning those new systems helps reduce risks of Alzheimer's and other degenerative disorders. So can't stress enough the importance of taking that from a health perspective. And so we would just ask you to drop in the chats. What might be something that you do for play? Is there one thing that you do that you really value for physical care or that you would want to do more of as you go forward? But if you think about these things in terms of play, caring for your body, what might be something that y'all have found helpful or that you would like to increase because you recognize the value of?
And if you don't write it in the chat, write it down on your piece of paper and see if there's ways that you can incorporate this in your life. Really important stuff. And as Chad keeps going for time, I'll let you consider that and feel free to drop it in as you come across it.
Sounds good. And then tied to that, the intellectual domain from SAMHSA's perspective is recognizing creative abilities and finding ways to expand knowledge and skills. So this could be finding ways to re-stimulate your engagement with your environment. Reading is definitely one that continues to have very good impacts, positive impacts on our brains. And then I already mentioned a little bit about engaging in stimulating hobbies. This picture off to the right is a watercolor that my wife's grandfather did. He and his wife were farmers in North Dakota. They did livestock and crop. And very late, when it was getting too hard for them to work on the farm, they both took a painting class at a local community center. And this was something that they continued to do until pretty much their last days. And so this was a painting that her grandfather did, I think probably in his late 70s, early 80s. And I was just completely blown away and impressed by the fact that he was willing to pick up, that both of them were willing to pick up this new skill set so late in life and how much enjoyment that it brought to them. So they can do it at that stage. There's no reason why any of us can't pick up something that we find pleasurable. And the benefits for it in terms of taking care of it for ourselves is fantastic. Taking care of ourselves is fantastic. Maintaining faith in religion or spirituality, again, anything that augments that sense of purpose. Improving sleep quality, that helps with the intellectual domain. Clinton already mentioned that. If you need some help with that, you can talk to your doctor or do some research around the term sleep hygiene. So sleep hygiene is non-medicated ways of improving sleep. Maintain social connection, which we've, I think, thoroughly conveyed through the course of this. And again, just ask you to consider what interest or skill or hobby that you might consider picking up.
Excellent. Pam shared, Chad, that she loves being on the land. I have challenges playing, such as bicycling due to injuries, and realize travel is now one for her as well. And travel is great. You get to see things, but I agree with you, Pam. Being on the land and getting away is a way that I take care of myself. I've talked to a number of farmers and they say that that is the place, just like Chad mentioned with the land logic, that they find the most connection to themselves and what they enjoy. And so I'm going to, with that, take us to our last domain. It is the spiritual domain, and it's expanding a sense of purpose and meaning in life. And I do want to just acknowledge that, we probably could have talked about one of these domains for the hour and a half, and we've been going through a lot. So I would like to finish as peacefully as we can as we look at this spiritual domain. And so I'm going to skip a few slides to get us where we can end on a high note. But I want to invite you to consider you. And this spiritual domain is connecting to the best and highest you, being true to you. And this is a lifelong journey. It's not something that we're going to give you in this hour and a half presentation. It's not going to be something you're going to get from reading any of the books or doing any of the research that we've talked about. This is going to be you taking the space in your life to really honor and support you, finding out what you like, what works for you to restore you, what you want to be connected to, saying no when you need to say no. This next one is really hard for many of us, but self-respect and compassion for ourselves is often so hard for us to give because we have high expectations. Exploring what does it mean for you to learn to forgive yourself and move forward, to learn to connect in ways that feed you instead of ways that steal life from you or steal time. Those things are so important for us all to be connected to. A restorative life values and looks after your own well-being. And I'm going to quickly go through these next slides to get to this slide. And I want to finish with two things. And the first one is just not being able to overstate the importance of breath, and every day connecting with your breath, because it's the quickest way to down-regulate your system and reconnect with yourself. So this last exercise I'm going to give you is called box breathing, and it was created by the Marines to help them in moments where they feel heightened stress or heightened anxiety around things that are going on. I mentioned that I do a breathing exercise before I go to bed at night, and this is the one that I do. It's really simple. It takes 16 seconds to go through a cycle. I'm going to take us through 2 cycles, and I want you to be as present as you can right now with each part of this cycle. So we're going to breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, and hold for 4 seconds. So again, take a cleansing breath and then breathe in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, breathe out, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Again, breathe in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, breathe out, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Now breathe normal and just feel your body present to the air that it's breathing. And again, if you can do this outside in the open air, that's even better. But if you're sitting at a desk or in your bed at night, connecting to this breath will connect you to your life, which connects you to you. There's a couple other. One is figure 8 breathing. You can do this in the sand just by drawing a figure 8 and breathing in each time that you go up and breathing down each time you go down. Things that connect us to the motion flow of our breath can connect us back to us. 5-finger breathing is where you go up and down your fingers. As you breathe up, as you go up, you breathe in. As you go down, you breathe out. Slow connections to that breath is so vital. And the thing that I want to leave us with that I feel like connects us as well as anything to our life and the gratitude that we have and the joy that we experience are gratitude and joy inventories. And these are things that have been introduced to me at different times, and I've done them in different ways. I like to do them with my family over dinner to check in about a gratitude for the day or something that brought them joy that day. This takes us back to the part of our life that often is the most restorative. When animals die or irrigation lines break or our kids get sick or we get sick, what are the things that we're grateful for? So as we close, and we've got like 1 minute to close, I want to invite you to take this last minute to really take down those 2 statements, write them in your notebook, take a picture, and later today, later this week, make a list of 3 things that you're really grateful for that when life gets hard, you can resort back to and remember. And what are 3 things that really bring you joy that you can invite more of in your life? Those things are the things that are going to give you a restorative lifestyle when life becomes full, busy, and hard. So I'm going to leave you with this next slide, which is Chad and my contact information, and just speak for both of us in saying, please reach out. Please get in touch if you have any questions or want to talk more about anything we said. And Chad, you got any closing statement or thought?
Just appreciate everyone. We know how valuable your time is. And so the fact that you allowed yourself to spend a little bit of time focusing on wellness, definitely respect that, appreciate it. And hopefully it's given you a little bit to think about. Maybe there's 1 or 2 areas that you may just try to ratchet up how to take care of yourself. That's our hope.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Clinton and Chad, for joining.